Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. We have reached one of my personal heroes, and he's right over my shoulder there, Walt Whitman, with his epic poem, Song of Myself. And you might have noticed this, it's a very long poem, and there's so much in here that it's tough to figure out what to do with such an extended work. So first thing we'll do is we'll talk about what about Song of Myself is romantic. Remember that the R in romantic stands for revolution. This poem is full of freedom. You might have noticed that even though as it's set up on the page, is portrait with these long lines that we have. You might notice that some lines just keep going and going and going. It's almost as if Whitman wanted the pages to be turned landscape sideways to give that impression of exuberance and spontaneity in voice, kind of like when you're in a conversation with someone who's just so full of energy and that person just keeps going and going. That's one of the things that I get from Song of Myself, is that sense of energy and urgency. Another unique part of Song of Myself that ties in with the sense of freedom in verse of Whitman, is the first poet to come up with catalogs. As you go through and you read this extended poem, you'll notice that he has created long lists and throughout the poem in certain places. That's very unique for the day, and even as well today in contemporary times. Another thing regarding the freedom that Walt Whitman brings in Song of Myself is eroticism. When Whitman wrote this poem, he had it bound, was trying to get it published as its own little volume, and nobody would touch it. So what he did, out of his own pocket, he paid for the publication at what's called a vanity press. So in other words, he self-published it. And then he sent out copies to be reviewed, and nobody liked it. And one of the reasons why they didn't like it was the erotic nature of many parts of the poem. Another example of freedom. As we move away from Wordsworth and England, right, we're centered there with the country. When we get to Whitman, he's going to say, you know what, I'm not going to be bound by any poetic rules. Romanticism is all about revolution. Whitman is as much a poet of the city as he is of the country. And he is always a poet of the self. And this is a good connection that we can make with Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey and subjectivity. If you remember from our lectures there, when we look at the title of this poem, Song of Myself, it could easily be translated as Song of Walt Whitman, right? So we're dealing with that idea of perspective, what one person sees, and they put it down in, verse and poetry for us to experience their vision. So what we see in Song of Myself is the Song of Walt Whitman. It's very, very subjective. Also, transcendence. If you'll remember when we talked before with Tintern Abbey about transcendence, what we're going to see is with Song of Myself, Song of Walt Whitman, that the individual will be able to encompass everyone and all human experience. So what happens with Whitman is that he's like a guide and a prophet. He's showing us what he knows, right? His perspective, right? That subjective vein, so that we, the reader, likewise will have a new way of seeing. Wow, I know. It says it's like being in part with a visionary solipsism, being in touch with a prophet in verse. So there's lots of different things for us to touch upon as we go through in the lectures that are coming up. We'll try to focus in on relationship to God, death, as well as look at how Whitman answers the question, what is the self? And of course, all of this is going to be wrapped up with ideas of transcendence, this sense of freedom with romanticism, and firmly entrenched in the subjectivity of Whitman. And in case you're curious, we'll be bouncing around a lot, and we don't have time to cover all of the different sections. So if you want just to pull from the text these sections and get them ready to jot down notes as we go through, this poem is broken up into sections, and then each section is broken up into stanzas, and it can really be a handful. But it's a joyous, prophetic, visionary handful. So in the following lectures, we'll go ahead and we'll start jumping deep and begin in sections 1 and 2 as we start to move through and address some of those different topics. So we'll see each other in just a minute.